You're standing in a modern grocery store, staring at the same boring vegetables your great-great-great-grandmother would have recognized. Carrots, onions, cabbage, maybe some trendy kale if you're feeling adventurous. But here's the thing that's going to blow your mind. You're living in agricultural poverty compared to a medieval peasant. That's right. While you're getting excited about finding organic butternut squash for $8 a pound, medieval farmers were cultivating vegetables so weird, so wonderful, and so explosively nutritious that modern agriculture basically said, nah, too complicated, and gave up on them entirely. We're talking about vegetables that could cure diseases, survive famines, and taste so good that kings literally went to war over trade routes to get them. Vegetables that grew like weeds, but packed more nutrition than your entire modern vitamin cabinet. Today, you're going to discover 15 medieval vegetables that were so good, so nutritious, and so perfectly adapted to human needs that it's almost criminal we stopped growing them. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why your ancestors ate better than you do, and how you can change that. But first, let me tell you something that's going to make you question everything you know about food. Picture this. You're a medieval gardener in 1347, and your vegetable patch looks like an alien landscape compared to today's farms. You've got plants with names that sound like fantasy creatures: Skirret, Alexander's, Good King Henry, and every single one of them is packed with more nutrition than anything you'll find in a modern supermarket. But here's the part that's going to make you angry. A study from the University of Texas found that modern vegetables have lost 6% of their protein, 16% of their calcium, 6% of their iron, and 38% of their riboflavin compared to their 1950s counterparts. And 1950s vegetables were already degraded compared to medieval ones. Why? Because medieval vegetables weren't bred for shipping and shelf life. They were bred for one thing: keeping you alive through brutal winters and famines that would make modern food shortages look like minor inconveniences. These plants were nutritional powerhouses that could grow in terrible soil, survive weather that would kill modern crops, and provide medicine along with meals. They were the ultimate survival food, engineered by centuries of human desperation and ingenuity. And we threw them away for convenience. We literally traded superfoods for vegetables that could survive being trucked across continents and still look pretty under fluorescent lights. Think about that for a second. Your ancestors, living through plagues, famines, and wars, ate better than you do. They had access to vegetables so nutritious and flavorful that modern food scientists are just now rediscovering them and going, oh my God, why did we stop growing these? But it gets worse. Medieval gardeners weren't just growing more nutritious vegetables, they were growing them more sustainably. While modern agriculture destroys topsoil, requires massive inputs of fertilizer and pesticides, and creates monocultures vulnerable to disease, medieval gardens were diverse ecosystems. A typical medieval garden might have 30 to 50 different varieties of vegetables, herbs, and fruits, all growing together. They practiced companion planting, used natural pest control, and created soil that got richer every year instead of more depleted. They didn't have a choice. There was no global food system to fall back on. If their garden failed, they starved. So they developed vegetables that were incredibly resilient, incredibly nutritious, and incredibly productive. And here's the kicker. Many of these vegetables were perennials, meaning you planted them once and harvested for years or even decades. Imagine planting spinach once and getting fresh greens for the next 10 years. Medieval gardeners didn't have to imagine it, they lived it. So let's dive into these forgotten superfoods and discover what we gave up for the privilege of eating bland, nutritionally empty vegetables year-round. Skirret. Let's start with skirret. The medieval carrot that puts modern carrots to shame and makes you question why anyone thought orange roots were an improvement. You plant these sweet, parsnip-like roots in spring, and by autumn you're harvesting clusters of finger-thick tubers that taste like a cross between carrots and sweet potatoes, but with a complex, nutty flavor that modern carrots can't even dream of achieving. But here's what's going to blow your mind. Skirret was so popular that it appeared on royal banquet tables and peasant stews alike. Kings and commoners fought over the same vegetable. It was the universal crowd pleaser, beloved by everyone from Henry VIII to the poorest serf. And the nutrition? 1 cup of skirret provided more vitamin C than an orange, more potassium than a banana, and more fiber than modern, high-fiber cereals. It was basically nature's multivitamin with incredible flavor. Medieval cooks were obsessed with skirret. They roasted it, boiled it, candied it, and even made it into wine. Thomas Tusser, a 16th-century farmer, wrote entire poems about how amazing skirret was. Actual poems about a root vegetable. Why don't we grow it anymore? Because it's too much work to harvest. Modern agriculture looked at a vegetable that required you to carefully dig up clusters of delicate roots and said, nope, too complicated. Medieval people didn't mind spending an extra 10 minutes digging up their dinner if it meant eating something that actually tasted good and kept them healthy. We chose convenience over flavor, uniformity over nutrition, and ease of harvesting over actually enjoying our food. And we wonder why vegetables taste like cardboard now. Next up, Alexander's, the medieval celery that actually tastes good and makes modern celery look like the agricultural equivalent of cardboard. You know how modern celery is basically crunchy water with an attitude problem? Alexander's was the opposite, intense, aromatic, with a flavor that's part celery, part parsley, part black pepper, and part something completely unique that you can't get from any modern vegetable. Medieval cooks used every single part of this plant, and I mean every part. The leaves went into soups and stews, the stems were eaten raw or cooked like asparagus, the roots were pickled for winter storage, the flower buds were treated like capers, and the seeds were ground as a spice so valuable it was traded like currency. It was like having an entire spice rack and vegetable garden rolled into one plant. Imagine going to your backyard and harvesting seasoning, vegetables, pickles, and spices all from the same plant. That's what medieval people did with Alexander's. And unlike modern celery, which requires perfect growing conditions, constant watering, and will die if you look at it wrong, Alexander's grew wild along coastlines and in gardens with absolutely zero care. It was nature's gift to lazy gardeners. Plant it once, ignore it completely, and harvest gourmet food for years. The Romans were so obsessed with Alexander's that they called it the black pot herb and considered it essential for any serious cook. Medieval monasteries grew acres of it because it was basically a complete food source that required no maintenance. But here's the tragic part. Alexander's was so common in medieval Europe that it was considered a weed, a delicious, nutritious, useful weed that we somehow convinced ourselves we didn't need anymore. Then there's Good King Henry, which sounds like a pub name but was actually medieval spinach on steroids, pumped up with nutrition that would make modern supplement companies weep with envy. This plant was so nutritious and reliable that it earned the nickname poor man's asparagus, but that's selling it short. This wasn't poor man's anything. This was rich man's food that happened to grow like a weed. You could eat the young shoots like asparagus, the leaves like spinach, the flower buds like broccoli, and the seeds like quinoa. One plant, 4 different vegetables, all incredibly nutritious. It was like nature's version of a meal kit, but one that lasted for decades. And when I say nutritious, I mean it would put modern superfoods to shame. The leaves contained more iron than spinach, more vitamin C than oranges, more protein than most modern leafy greens, and more calcium than milk. Medieval peasants eating good King Henry were getting better nutrition than modern people taking expensive supplements. But here's what's really incredible. Good King Henry was perennial. You planted it once and harvested for up to 20 years. 20 years. Modern spinach dies after one season and requires you to replant constantly. Good King Henry just kept giving. Medieval farmers loved it so much they called it all good, because there was literally nothing bad about it. It grew in terrible soil, survived droughts, tolerated freezing weather, and provided fresh food when everything else was dead. The plant was so valuable that entire villages would have communal Good King Henry patches. It was like having a nutritional insurance policy that never expired, and we gave it up for regular spinach, which requires perfect conditions, dies constantly, and has been bred to be so mild that it's basically green water. We traded a nutritional powerhouse that lasted decades for a vegetable that tastes like disappointment. Now, woad is famous for making the blue dye that painted Celtic warriors and enriched medieval merchants. But here's what nobody tells you. Medieval people ate it too, and it was basically medicine disguised as food. The young leaves were a bitter green vegetable, packed with the same compounds that made the dye so valuable. But those compounds weren't just for color. They were natural antibiotics, anti-inflammatory agents, and immune system boosters. You'd harvest woad leaves in early spring when they were tender, boil them to remove the bitterness, and eat them like spinach. The plant was so valuable that entire regions built their economies around it. Towns like Toulouse in France became wealthy just from growing woad. But here's what's absolutely wild. Woad contains isatin, a compound that has natural antibiotic properties. Medieval people were literally eating medicine with their vegetables, getting natural infection protection with every meal. The plant was also loaded with antioxidants, vitamins, and minerals. Studies have shown that woad leaves contain compounds that can help fight cancer, reduce inflammation, and boost immune function. Medieval peasants eating woad were getting cancer-fighting medicine disguised as dinner. And because woad was grown commercially for dye, it was everywhere. Medieval people had access to a medicinal superfood that grew in massive quantities across Europe. They were eating pharmaceutical-grade nutrition and didn't even know it. We gave up eating woad because synthetic dyes made it economically worthless, and we forgot that it was ever food in the first place. We literally threw away a medicinal vegetable because we didn't need the dye anymore. Orach was medieval spinach before spinach existed in Europe, and it makes modern spinach look like a nutritional lightweight that gave up before the fight even started. This plant came in multiple colors, deep green, blood red, and golden yellow, making medieval salads look like modern farmers' market displays, but with better nutrition and flavor. You grew orach because it thrived in poor soil where other vegetables would shrivel up and die. It was drought-tolerant, pest-resistant, and incredibly nutritious. The leaves were mild and tender, perfect for raw eating or cooking, and they didn't have that bitter bite that makes modern spinach such a chore to eat. But here's what made orach special. It was salt-tolerant. You could grow it in coastal soils where nothing else would survive. Medieval people living near the sea could have fresh vegetables, even in soil that would kill modern crops. The plant was so reliable that it was often the only green vegetable available during droughts. When everything else failed, orach kept growing. It was like having a backup food system that never failed. Medieval gardeners loved orach because it was foolproof. You could basically throw the seeds anywhere and get a harvest. It self-seeded, grew in terrible conditions, and provided massive amounts of food with zero effort. And the nutrition? Orach was loaded with vitamins A, C, and K, plus minerals like iron, calcium, and magnesium. It was basically a multivitamin that grew in your garden. We gave up orach for regular spinach, which requires perfect soil, constant watering, and dies if you look at it wrong. We traded a bulletproof vegetable for one that's basically agricultural prima donna. Bladder campion sounds like a medical condition you'd rather not have, but it was actually a delicate medieval green with a unique claim to fame. The young shoots tasted exactly like fresh peas, but grew like a weed and never needed replanting. You'd harvest bladder campion in early spring when the shoots were tender and sweet, and you'd be amazed at how something that looked like a random wild plant could taste like premium vegetables. Medieval people called it wild asparagus because of its delicate flavor and texture, but honestly, that's underselling it. This plant had a complex, subtle flavor that was part pea, part asparagus, part something entirely unique that you can't get from any modern vegetable. But here's what made bladder campion special. It was completely wild. You didn't have to plant it, water it, or take care of it. It just grew naturally in fields and gardens, providing free gourmet food for anyone who knew what to look for. The plant got its name from the inflated seed pods that looked like tiny bladders, but don't let the weird name fool you. This was gourmet food that grew everywhere. Medieval foragers would fill baskets with bladder campion shoots and feed their families like they were shopping at an upscale farmer's market. And because it was perennial, bladder campion came back every year in the same spots. Medieval people could return to the same patches year after year, harvesting delicious vegetables without ever planting anything. We lost bladder campion because we stopped foraging and started relying entirely on cultivated crops. We gave up free, delicious, nutritious food because we decided that only planted vegetables counted as real food. Tree onions were the medieval equivalent of having a renewable onion subscription service that lasted for decades and never sent you a bill. Instead of forming bulbs underground like regular onions, these magical plants grew clusters of small bulbs at the top of tall stalks. It was like nature decided to put onions on trees because apparently growing them in the ground wasn't convenient enough. You'd plant tree onions once, and they'd provide you with fresh onions for decades. The bulbs at the top would fall off and plant themselves, creating new onion plants automatically. It was like having a self-replicating food source that required zero maintenance. But here's what made tree onions absolutely brilliant. They were always available. Need onions in winter? The bulbs stored for months without refrigeration. Need green onions in spring? The shoots were perfect for fresh eating. Need new plants next year? The plant took care of that itself. Medieval cooks loved tree onions because they solved the onion storage problem completely. Regular onions would rot, sprout, or dry out. Tree onions just kept producing fresh food year after year. The bulbs were smaller than regular onions, but they were intensely flavorful and incredibly versatile. You could use them fresh, pickle them, dry them, or plant them. They were like having a Swiss Army knife that tasted like onions. And because they were perennial, tree onions created permanent food security. Once you had them, you had onions forever. Medieval families would pass tree onion patches down through generations like family heirlooms. We gave up tree onions for regular onions that die every year, require replanting, and need perfect storage conditions. We traded a self-sustaining onion system for vegetables that require constant work and replacement. Hamburg parsley was the medieval root vegetable that did double duty and makes modern vegetables look like they're not even trying. You got parsley leaves for seasoning and thick white roots that tasted like a cross between parsnips and celery root, but with a complex, nutty flavor that made simple peasant dishes taste like something from a royal kitchen. This plant was incredibly popular in medieval Europe because it gave you two completely different crops in one. You could harvest the leaves all season long for flavoring soups and stews, then dig up the roots in fall for winter storage. But here's what made Hamburg parsley special. The roots were incredibly versatile and stored beautifully. You could roast them like potatoes, boil them like parsnips, grate them raw into salads, or slice them thin and fry them like chips. The flavor was complex and sophisticated, nutty, sweet, with hints of celery and parsley. Medieval cooks used Hamburg parsley roots to make simple stews taste like gourmet meals, and because the plant was biennial, it was incredibly productive. First year, you got leaves and roots. Second year, you got seeds to plant more. It was like having a vegetable savings account that kept paying dividends. Medieval monasteries grew acres of Hamburg parsley because it was so efficient. One plant provided seasoning, vegetables, and seeds for next year's crop. It was the ultimate efficient food crop. The roots were also incredibly nutritious, packed with vitamins, minerals, and fiber. Medieval people eating Hamburg parsley were getting complex carbohydrates, essential nutrients, and incredible flavor all in one package. We gave up Hamburg parsley for regular parsley that only gives you leaves and root vegetables that only give you roots. We traded efficiency for simplicity and lost both nutrition and flavor in the process. Corn salad, also called lamb's lettuce, was the medieval green that refused to quit and makes modern lettuce look like it gives up at the first sign of trouble. This small, tender plant grew through winter, providing fresh greens when everything else was dead, dormant, or just a frozen memory in the ground. You'd sow corn salad in late summer, and it would grow slowly through fall and winter, getting sweeter and more tender as the weather got colder. It was like having a vegetable that actually improved with adversity. The leaves were mild, slightly nutty, and incredibly tender, nothing like the bitter, tough greens that most winter vegetables become. Medieval people treasured corn salad because it was often the first fresh green available after months of preserved food. But here's what made corn salad absolutely essential. It was loaded with vitamin C. During medieval winters, when fresh fruit was impossible to find and scurvy was a real threat, corn salad provided life-saving nutrition. The plant was so cold-hardy that it could survive under snow and keep growing. Medieval people would literally dig through snow to harvest fresh salad greens. Imagine having fresh, tender lettuce available in January without a greenhouse or any technology at all. Corn salad was also incredibly productive. A small patch could provide fresh greens for an entire family through the winter months. It was like having a renewable source of fresh vegetables when everything else was preserved, pickled, or long gone. Medieval monasteries cultivated corn salad specifically for winter nutrition. They understood that fresh greens in winter weren't just nice to have, they were essential for preventing disease and maintaining health. We gave up corn salad for lettuce that dies at the first frost and requires heated greenhouses to grow in winter. We traded a hardy, nutritious winter vegetable for one that can't survive mild weather. Fennel flower, also called nigella or love in a mist, was the medieval spice that moonlighted as a vegetable and makes modern herbs look like they're not even trying to be useful. The young leaves were edible and had a complex flavor that was part onion, part herb, part spice, and part something completely unique that you can't get from any modern plant. You grew fennel flower primarily for its seeds, which were used as a spice and medicine. The seeds were so valuable they were called black cumin and traded across continents. But medieval cooks discovered that the young leaves and shoots were delicious too. The plant was incredibly ornamental, with delicate blue flowers and feathery foliage that looked like something from a fairy garden. Medieval gardens were both beautiful and functional, and fennel flower was a perfect example of that philosophy. But here's what made fennel flower special. Every part was useful. The seeds were ground as spice, the leaves were eaten as vegetables, the flowers were used for decoration, and the whole plant was considered medicinal. Medieval people used fennel flower seeds to aid digestion, treat respiratory problems, and even as a natural preservative for food. The leaves were eaten fresh or dried for winter use. The plant was also incredibly easy to grow. You could scatter the seeds anywhere and get a harvest. It self-seeded readily, so once you had it forever. And because it was so ornamental, fennel flower made medieval gardens beautiful while providing food and medicine. It was like having a decorative plant that also happened to be a complete pharmacy and spice rack. We gave up fennel flower because we decided that plants should either be ornamental or useful, not both. We separated beauty from function and lost both in the process. Medieval rocket was not the mild arugula you know today. This was rocket with attitude, peppery, pungent, and packed with flavor that could wake the dead. You grew rocket because it was fast, easy, and added serious flavor to boring medieval meals. The leaves were ready to harvest in just a few weeks, making it perfect for quick crops between main plantings. Medieval rocket was so potent that it was considered an aphrodisiac. Whether that was true or not, it definitely made food more interesting. Wild garlic was the medieval herb that grew like a vegetable. In early spring, entire forests would be carpeted with wild garlic, providing free food for anyone who knew where to look. You'd harvest wild garlic leaves before the plant flowered, when they were tender and mild. The flavor was gentler than regular garlic, but still distinctive enough to flavor entire meals. Medieval people loved wild garlic because it was one of the first fresh foods available after winter. It was like nature's way of saying, "Welcome back to the world of flavor." Bronze fennel was the medieval herb that doubled as a vegetable and a medicine. The feathery leaves were beautiful, the stems were edible, and the seeds were both spice and medicine. You grew bronze fennel because it was gorgeous, useful, and practically indestructible. The plant would self-seed and return year after year, creating a permanent source of food and medicine. Medieval cooks used fennel leaves to flavor fish, fennel stems as a vegetable, and fennel seeds as a digestive aid after meals. It was the Swiss Army knife of medieval plants. Borage was the medieval vegetable that tasted like cucumbers but grew like a weed. The young leaves had a fresh, cucumber-like flavor that was perfect for salads and soups. You grew borage because it was virtually indestructible and self-seeding. Once you planted it, you'd have borage forever. The plant also produced beautiful blue flowers that were edible and looked stunning in medieval gardens. Medieval people believed borage had mood-lifting properties. Whether that was true or not, having fresh cucumber-flavored greens growing wild in your garden would definitely improve anyone's mood. Finally, winter purslane was the medieval green that grew when everything else gave up. This plant thrived in cold weather, providing fresh, succulent leaves through winter when other vegetables were just memories. You'd plant winter purslane in fall, and it would grow slowly through the coldest months, ready to harvest whenever you needed fresh greens. The leaves were thick, succulent, and mild, perfect for winter salads or cooked dishes. Medieval people treasured winter purslane because it was often the only fresh vegetable available during the hardest months of the year. So what happened to all these amazing vegetables? Why did we trade nutritional powerhouses for bland, mass-produced crops? The answer is depressingly simple: industrial agriculture. As farming became more mechanized and centralized, we started choosing vegetables based on how well they shipped, how long they lasted on shelves, and how uniformly they grew. Medieval vegetables were bred for nutrition, flavor, and local growing conditions. Modern vegetables are bred for profit and convenience. That skillet we talked about, too labor-intensive to harvest mechanically. Good King Henry, doesn't ship well. Alexander's, too strong flavored for mass-market appeal. We literally bred the nutrition and flavor out of our food in exchange for vegetables that could survive being trucked across continents and still look good under fluorescent lights. But here's what really hurts. These medieval vegetables were often more nutritious than anything we eat today. Modern studies have shown that fruits and vegetables have lost significant amounts of vitamins and minerals compared to their ancestors. That good King Henry had more protein than modern spinach. That auroch had more vitamins than modern lettuce. That wild garlic had more antioxidants than store-bought garlic. We didn't just lose interesting flavors, we lost nutritional density. Medieval peasants, eating from their diverse garden plots, were often better nourished than modern people shopping at upscale grocery stores. But here's the good news. These vegetables aren't gone forever. Seeds for most of them still exist, preserved by seed-saving organizations and specialty suppliers. You can grow skirret in your backyard. You can forage for Alexanders along coastlines. You can plant good King Henry and harvest it for years. Small-scale farmers and gardeners are rediscovering these forgotten vegetables, and slowly they're appearing at farmers' markets and specialty stores. Some high-end restaurants are even featuring medieval vegetables on their menus, introducing diners to flavors that haven't been tasted widely for centuries. So how do you get these amazing vegetables back into your life? Here are your options. First, grow them yourself. Many medieval vegetables are actually easier to grow than modern ones. They're adapted to variable conditions, resistant to pests, and often perennial, meaning you plant once and harvest for years. Second, look for them at farmers' markets. Small-scale growers are more likely to experiment with unusual vegetables, and many are specifically growing heirloom and heritage varieties. Third, forage for them. Many medieval vegetables still grow wild. That Alexander's is probably growing wild along your local coastline. That wild garlic might be carpeting your local woods each spring. Fourth, demand them. Ask your local garden center about heritage seeds. Ask your farmers market vendors about unusual vegetables. Ask your grocery store to stock more diverse produce. There's also a growing movement of seed savers working to preserve these forgotten varieties. Organizations like the Seed Savers Exchange maintain collections of heritage seeds and make them available to home gardeners. You can join this movement by growing heritage vegetables and saving seeds. Every time you plant a medieval vegetable and save its seeds, you're helping preserve genetic diversity that took centuries to develop. This isn't just about nostalgia. It's about food security. Those medieval vegetables developed resistance to diseases and pests that modern crops have never encountered. They adapted to local climates and soil conditions that modern agriculture ignores. Now, let's be fair. Modern agriculture has given us some amazing things. We have year-round access to fresh produce, we've eliminated most famines, and we can feed billions of people. But we've also lost something irreplaceable: the connection between food and place, the diversity of flavors and nutrition, and the knowledge of how to grow food that's adapted to local conditions. Medieval vegetables weren't just food. They were medicine, they were beauty, they were culture. Each region had its own varieties, its own flavors, its own traditions. We traded that diversity for convenience, and we're just now starting to realize what we lost. But the future doesn't have to be boring. Climate change is making growing conditions more unpredictable, and those hardy medieval vegetables might be exactly what we need. As more people become interested in local food, sustainable agriculture, and nutritional density, these forgotten vegetables are finding new audiences. You might not be able to find skirret at your local supermarket yet, but you can grow it in your garden. You might not be able to buy good King Henry at the farmer's market, but you can plant it and harvest it for decades. So the next time you're standing in that grocery store, looking at the same old vegetables, remember that you have options. You can choose to eat like a medieval peasant and eat better than most modern people. You can grow vegetables that taste like something, that provide real nutrition, and that connect you to thousands of years of human food culture. Those medieval vegetables deserve a comeback because they represent everything we gave up for convenience: flavor, nutrition, sustainability, and connection to the land. The question isn't whether these vegetables are good enough for modern life. The question is whether modern life is good enough for these vegetables. And honestly, looking at what we're eating now, I think we could use a little medieval wisdom in our gardens. Time to dig up the past and plant it in the future.